Hello everyone! Welcome back to an episode I've been wanting to make for a while. It is about The Good Place, Black Mirror, and the ethics of simulating conscious beings. And I think it's gonna be quite long, but I mean, you already know how long it is, you can see it. And just a warning, spoilers ahead for the entirety of The Good Place, a couple of episodes of Black Mirror, and perhaps the afterlife itself. Let's begin with a quick summary of The Good Place. We begin with Eleanor. She has just died, she wakes up in the afterlife, specifically in The Good Place, which is basically heaven. Except she knows she doesn't belong there. Then a bunch of stuff happens and Eleanor discovers that they are not in the good place. In fact, what happens is that Michael, who is basically a demon, created this fake heaven in order to torture Eleanor, Chidi, Tahani, and Jason. And after they find out the truth, he wipes their memories and reboots them, and does that over and over and over again. But every time they find out the truth. Then a bunch of stuff happens and Michael has a change of heart and joins the humans. Then they escape the bad place and they go with the judge of the afterlife to try to convince her not to send them to hell. And what happens is that she decides to send them back to Earth as a form of experiment to try to see if they can actually improve and become good people. However, Michael and a bunch of demons interfere with the experiment, and then the humans die all over again. Then they go to the neutral place, where they judge all the actions of all the people, and they discover that no one has been good enough to make it to the good place in centuries. And they discover that this is because whenever you do something, the world has become such an interconnected and messy place that all your actions have unintended consequences, which are pretty much always bad. And then they meet with the judge, they tell her everything they have found out, and they decide to make another experiment of another fake good place where they can see if a bunch of random humans can actually improve and become good people. And then the experiment works, and then the judge decides to reboot Earth, but then they convince her not to reboot Earth and start with a new system all over again. Then they design a new afterlife, where instead of being tortured forever if you were a bad person, instead you are given the chance to learn of your mistakes and become better until you are worthy of being in the good place. Then the protagonists go to the good place and they live happily forever after. And then they get tired of living happily forever after, and then they all commit suicide. Even Michael, presumably at some point, except Tahani. Happy ending. This is one of my favorite TV shows. I've seen all the episodes like 5 times. And you start to notice a couple of weird things. For example, there are no children, not even mentions of children. The only child that ever appears in the show is the stepsister of Eleanor. And I know why they did this. Like, the lore of the show implies that even children are being tortured forever by demons, which is horrifying. And so, yeah, they decided to simply never mention that implication. And another weird thing about this show is, where is God? Because this is a show all about the afterlife and ethics and philosophy. So you would think that the topic of God would come up many times, and yet it never does. Yeah, sure, there are a few mentions about God here and there, but they never discuss God philosophically or ethically. Janet knows everything. They could ask her about the nature of God, and she would probably explain you everything you wanted to know. And yet they never do, although presumably they did that off screen and then it just never was relevant to the show. You could argue that the judge is God since she seems to be in charge of everything in this celestial bureaucracy, but she's not all powerful. In fact, Janet can disobey her, and she doesn't seem to be all-knowing either. And in fact, she mentions being created a couple of times, so she cannot be God. And neither can Michael, nor Sean, nor any of the other members of the celestial bureaucracy for the same reasons. They are not all powerful, they don't know everything, and they mention being creative a few times. I even considered that maybe Janet was God. I mean, she is all powerful, she knows everything, and she could be anywhere. But when they go to Earth, she loses all of her powers, and she mentions being created a few times. And very interestingly, Janet tells us across the show many times what she is not. She tells us she's not a robot, not a girl, not a person. But there is one time where she tells us what she is.
Technically, I am the mainframe.
She is the mainframe. She is what allows humans and the members of the celestial bureaucracy to interact with whatever that is. What are they interacting with? What are they on? And this is where I started noticing that there are screens everywhere. There are passwords, there are security questions. I mean, the very fact that the afterlife is organized like a company, like a bureaucracy, a celestial bureaucracy, but still. And then I have this crazy idea. What if they are in a simulation? That would explain so much. That would explain everything. And if I was MathPad and this was film theory, I would start looking for a lot of evidence that this is indeed a simulation, and that would be interesting. But instead, I found a lot more interesting the ethical implications that this has for the simulation theory. And I suppose that at this point we have to talk about the simulation theory. The simulation theory proposes that we, you and I, are not really real, that in fact we are a simulation, that the whole universe where we live is simulated, and that there is a real universe where there is a civilization so advanced that they have the capacity to simulate many billions or trillions of other conscious beings. And that's exactly what they are doing, and that's you and I. One of the reasons many people don't like the idea of the simulation theory is because they don't like the idea of not being real, of being just an illusion in a computer in the real universe. Now, why would they do this? Well, it would be incredibly useful to study psychology, anthropology, economics, politics, and history. And the idea is that this civilization has what we call ancestor simulations, where they are simulating their past over and over and seeing how it changes in order to learn from it. And that's incredibly interesting. But is it ethical? To explore that question, we now need to go to Black Mirror. Black Mirror is a science fiction TV show where every episode is a standalone story. And in one of these episodes, White Christmas, we see that there is a rich woman that goes to the hospital to get a copy of her consciousness made. And then she wakes up, but turns out that she is not the original one. She is the copy. Apparently, she thought that when they made a copy of her consciousness, it would just be like a computer using a lot of information about herself to be like her servant and to be her personal assistant and do everything she wanted. But in fact, what she did not imagine is that the copy would feel like her. Like, she is thinking, I don't feel like a copy. I don't feel like a simulation. I feel like myself. And she doesn't want to comply. And so then come this guy who then basically tortures her. He locks her in a white void and then even stops simulating her body so that she's just a mind nowhere, like with no sensation. And finally, he makes her feel that years are going by in just mere minutes. And all that time, she was just in this white void with nothing to do. And then she finally decides to comply and be basically a slave for herself, her original self. It's all very disturbing. And then the guy that tortures this simulated woman is talking with this guy. And then this guy opens up and he tells the story of how he killed an old man and a young girl. It's a long story. But when this guy confesses, this guy disappears because turns out that the cabin where they were both speaking was a simulation. And in fact, that guy in the cabin, he was a simulation as well. He was a copy that they made of a criminal, and they put it in this simulation to trick him to confess to the crime that they couldn't get the original one to confess to. And then we see how the police, as they go to their homes for Christmas, decide to leave this simulated person in an experiencing like 100 years per second or something like that. And all the while he is alone, trapped in this cabin where it's always winter, there's always Christmas music playing, and he can always see through the window the dead body of the girl he killed. And that's hell. That's basically hell. Like, that's horrible. And he's gonna be there for thousands, perhaps millions of years. And the reason it works, the reason it is so impactful, is because we didn't know at the beginning that he was a simulation. We thought he was a real person. And that's why his suffering feels so horrifying. In fact, in the episode, this guy comments about how the copy of the woman was basically torture her into complying. And he said, and the other guy says like, oh, so you see her as a person. This is not just a simulation. To you, she's not just code. You have empathy. That's a good thing. And he implies that most people don't think like that. They have no problem taking these simulated people and torturing them in video games and stuff like that. But then, since we have seen these things happening from the point of view of the copies, who didn't know they were copies, who didn't feel like copies, they felt like the original people, we can see how absurd that argument is. We realized that this woman really was a person who did not want to be a slave to herself. We really realized that this man in this cabin, suffering for thousands of years, is really suffering. His regret is real. His torment is real. And the police have to know it as well. If they didn't believe that his feelings are real, why would they torture him in the first place? It's like a contradiction. They say like, oh, it's fine to hurt this simulated person because it's not a real person, it's just computer code. But then they enjoy torturing that person all the same because they know that those feelings that person is feeling are real. Because that's the thing. It doesn't matter if your mind is the product of evolution and the laws of physics, or if it's the product of humans and computer code. As long as you are conscious of what you are feeling, it is real to you. Like, it doesn't matter if my happiness, if my love is just chemicals in my brain or computer code, as long as I'm feeling it, it is real to me. Or rather, we could say that all of those are just illusions. Because, okay, take a look at this. These are the fundamental particles of the universe, according to our current knowledge of physics. And all of them have properties that never change and that we can use to identify them. So we can say that we can measure the electronness of the electron. We can measure the down quarkness of the down quark. We can measure the photonness of the photon. And in short, we can say that these particles have real identities within the universe. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, because our identities are not like the identities of fundamental particles. There's nothing you can measure of me to find my fairness. I'm not saying fairness in terms of being fair. I'm just saying fairness because fair is my name, so that's like my essence. The point is that our identities are illusions. They are not real. For the universe, everything that exists are these particles. For the universe, there are no books, there are no computers, no desks, no microphones, no cameras. For the universe, all that exists are these particles. These are the real identities. And everything else are just concepts that exist in our minds that help us make sense of the universe. Even the concept we have of ourselves. You can see this with the metaphor of the ship of Theseus. You have a ship that is made of like 1,000 pieces of wood, and then you change one, and then you change another one, and you change another one every time a piece of wood needs to be replaced to repair the ship. And then at some point you have replaced all the planks of wood. Is this a different ship? It is? Is it a different ship? The answer is that the ship never existed to begin with. The idea of the ship was an illusion. And this is one of the core tenets of Buddhism, realizing that the separation, that all of these concepts we have in our minds are just illusions. Even the self is an illusion. And that if you ever rise above the noise and confusion and get a glimpse beyond this illusion, then you will reach nirvana. And I agree with that. I agree 100%. I'm just not sure that it's actually possible for humans to actually perceive reality beyond the illusion. Like, that's the aspect of Buddhism that I feel like requires faith, that reaching nirvana is actually possible. That's the part of Buddhism that doesn't convince me. But anyway, the point is that if we accept that we are illusions, well, then any simulated being, any artificial intelligence is an illusion just like us. And if our feelings are valid, are important in any way, then so are the feelings of simulated beings. It doesn't matter if we are being simulated by the laws of physics or by a computer code. A simulation is still a simulation, and all that matters is that the simulated individual perceives their feelings and perceives their own mind, their own identity to be real. In my mind, that's all that matters. And this seems to be the same argument that Black Mirror is doing by showing us the suffering of all of these simulated beings. And most of the times, this suffering comes from other people not accepting that these simulated beings are just as real as anyone else. And this disregard for the feelings of these simulated creatures creates over and over things that can only be called hell. Except for one episode where they actually care for the feelings of these simulated beings, and it creates literal heaven. One of my favorite episodes, Saint Junipero. In this episode, we see a world where old people have the options to have their consciousness copied into a computer and then be placed in a simulation where they can do anything they want. They can play video games, they can go to parties, they can go to the beach, they can go to Fight Club, they can do anything they want. And then we meet these two protagonists who find love in this simulation. And in fact, they decide to stay permanently in that simulation. And it's so beautiful because they stay there in that simulation, loving each other and being happy. And they have all the time in the world to be with each other and love each other. And it is so beautiful because they say that in heaven love comes first. Well, and they made heaven a place on earth. And in fact, this is very similar to something Chidi says in the last episode, that the good place is not just a place that is perfect, where there is no suffering. He says that the good place is just time with the people we love. And this is exactly what the protagonist in San Junipero gets. Okay, so let's see. If Black Mirror argues that by simulating other conscious beings, we can either put them in hell or put them in heaven, what does that mean for the simulation theory? Is it even ethical? Okay, so let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine a being that has the technology, the capacity to simulate an entire universe. And let's call this being the simulator. The simulator wonders what should they do with this technology. Perhaps they consider the possibility of making an ancestor simulation because of everything they could learn from it. But the simulator quickly concludes that this would be very unethical. Because consider human history. Imagine how many wars have happened, how many genocides, how many people died of preventable illnesses because they didn't have the technology. Imagine just the mountains of suffering that have existed through human history. If you accept that simulated beings are as real as anyone else and that their feelings matter, then you cannot subject millions of other conscious beings to that level of suffering. It's simply unethical. It's like you would be committing thousands of genocides. You would be responsible of all the suffering that happens through history. Okay, so the simulator decides that making ancestor simulations is incredibly unethical. And just as a side note, that's why I think that we are not living in a simulation. I hope that any civilization that has the capacity to do that would realize how unethical it would be, and they would have some compassion, I hope. Anyway, now that the simulator has decided not to create an ancestor simulation, should they do anything else with this technology? And there's the option to not even use this technology, to not simulate anyone. And I am sure that many of you could make very good and convincing arguments as to why this technology shouldn't be used at all. But perhaps the simulator is moved by other arguments, perhaps some utilitarian arguments, because in utilitarianism, everything that matters is to maximize the amount of pleasure, of joy, of happiness. And if you simulate a perfect universe where everyone is happy, where no one has to suffer, well, that would create a lot of happiness. And if you don't do that, well, all that happiness would not exist. And so an utilitarian could argue that if you have the capacity to simulate a universe, you have the responsibility to simulate a perfect universe where no one suffers in order to maximize the level of happiness. Now, again, there are arguments against this, but let's say that the simulator is convinced by this argument and decides to start a simulation of a perfect universe. However, this is a crucial point, because once you start simulating a universe, you cannot go back, because if you stop simulating all those consciousness, you are doing something very bad. One thing is to not bring someone into existence in the first place. That's acceptable. But once someone is existing and you bring them out of existence, that's murder, even if it's just stopping the simulation. And maybe the simulator considers this, but by then the simulation has already started. Millions of consciousness have already been generated, and stopping the simulation now would be murder. And so the simulation goes on. Another thing to consider is how will the simulated beings interact with the simulation. If they want or need something, they should be able to get it, but perhaps the simulation is just too complex for them to manipulate it. Then it would be useful if there was some kind of mind frame, some kind of something that helped them to interact with this simulation. And that thing would need to be intelligent in order to understand all the requests and all the nuances of what they ask. And so let's say that the simulator creates this kind of mind frame and names her, I don't know, just a random name, Janet or whatever. Then the simulator lets 1,000,000 years of simulation time go by, because they can make the simulation time go way faster than the real world. And then they decide to check on the simulation, and they find a lot of problems. Turns out that many of these simulated beings have turned out to be very cruel and mean, and in interacting with other conscious beings, they are just making each other miserable. In fact, many of them are suffering emotional pain at the same level as physical pain. As they say, hell is other people, and these people have turned what was supposed to be a paradise into, well, hell. The simulator cannot accept this. The only reason this simulation exists is because of the moral imperative to maximize happiness. But the problem is that most of these simulated beings have never had consequences for their actions. They don't care about the suffering of others because for a long time they never suffered. They always had what they wanted. The problem is that by living in this world with no consequences, they just never learned to be good people. This means that the simulation needs a major rework. The simulator decides that all of these simulated beings need to experience, at least for a short while, a world where there are consequences, a world where there is suffering, a world where they can learn to become good people, so that then they won't turn this good place into a bad place. And I know that many of you have other ideas for other things the simulator could do. And if you have, please tell me in the comments. But the point is that the simulator is acting logically, that we can understand why the simulator is choosing to do all of these things. And that becomes very crucial in this next part, because the simulator has a very big problem. The simulated beings who learn to be good people will be rewarded with this utopia the simulation was supposed to be since the beginning. But what should happen with all of the simulated beings that do not learn this lesson, with all of these simulated beings that continue being cruel and mean and who would ruin this good place? Well, the simulator could reason that since some of them will be rewarded eternally for being good, it is only just that the others are tortured eternally for being bad. And this is where you and I would hopefully disagree the most with the simulator, because it just no finite crime deserves infinite punishment. It simply doesn't. That's one of the things that I like the most about The Good Place. It makes you really consider the idea of eternal torture, and you realize just how horrifying and undefendable it is. But in a way, it is just. If you go for justice, yeah, you kind of have to accept this. And so, yeah, maybe what happens is that justice itself is a flawed concept, that we shouldn't strive for a world that gives everyone what they deserve, but instead we should strive for a system that makes other people become deserving of better things. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The point is that the simulator decides that everyone who doesn't learn their lesson, doesn't learn to be good people, will be tortured eternally. But this creates yet another problem. Who will torture all of the bad people? And who will reward all of the good people? And who will solve any disputes that arise between these two factions? To solve this, we need to talk quickly about artificial intelligences. And in fact, I'm going to leave you a link to this video, which is very good. It explains this topic much better. But the point is that there is no way to logically argue that you should want the things you want. For example, imagine that you have a robot, and this robot is very smart, and it can discuss philosophy, play games, and do anything you can. It's as smart as you. And then you notice that this robot is running out of batteries. And so you tell him that he should recharge himself. And then the robot says, why? And you are like, well, if you don't, you're going to be turned off. So what? And you are like, don't you want to, well, keep being conscious, keep existing? And the robot says not really. Because if you don't program the robot to want to continue existing, it simply won't want to continue existing. And there is no logical argument you could make to convince him that he should want this. That robot will only want the things it is programmed to want. And that even applies to us. All the things we want, if we want to be happy, if we want to continue existing, if we want not to suffer, we want all of these things because, in a way, evolution programmed those things into us. And there is no logical argument that could make someone that doesn't have those desires to have them. They have to be programmed, they have to be built into that consciousness, into that creature. And the way that researchers today in the real world program those desires into artificial intelligences is by giving them these things called reward functions, which is something that activates when they are fulfilling their purpose. And keep that in mind, we are gonna come back to that in a while. This means that the simulator could create another kind of conscious beings whose only desire is to keep the simulation running and don't really care about suffering or pleasure. In fact, the simulator could program the beings that are meant to torture the bad people to seek experiences that cause suffering, so that they can better learn to cause suffering in others, but they themselves would not suffer from these experiences. And so they would do crazy things like eat food that just tastes horribly, and they would insult each other all the time, and they would listen to terrible music, and they would do horrible things just all of the time, because that's what they need to do. That's what they are programmed to do in order to learn to better keep the simulation running, which is at the end of the day their only goal. And at this point, the simulation created by our hypothetical simulator is very similar to what we see in The Good Place, with all the demons and the angels and Janet and all of the people being tested on Earth to decide their place in the afterlife. And this reframes the entire story of The Good Place. For example, when the judge sends the Soul Squad back to Earth to see if they can become good people, this mirrors what the simulator did when they sent everyone to Earth in the first place to see if they could become good people. This even explains a lot of weird comments made by Sean and other demons about being paid to torture humans, about the suffering of humans being their sustenance. If you think back to the reward function as their form of payment, as their sustenance, it makes perfect sense. Even Michael's change of heart makes sense within this context. If all of these beings have slightly different reward functions, and his reward function was more focused on understanding humans, then all his obsession about these tiny details about being human, about sweat, about paper clips and playing guitar and all those things make perfect sense. And that explains why he was motivated to understand humans until he develops compassion for them and he eventually becomes a human himself. This also explains why Chidi seems to know more about philosophy than Michael or the judge, who are immortal, eternal beings, because presumably what they know about these topics is what the simulator programmed into them. And so, since the simulator doesn't know everything about ethics and philosophy, they wouldn't know everything either. But the simulated beings can have a lot of experiences and they can learn a lot of things that the simulator didn't know, like Chidi, and he can teach all of these other beings everything he has learned. Which is really interesting when you think about it. This also explains why angels were such pushovers, because part of their reward function was to always be nice to everyone, which is, when you think about it, a pretty imperfect reward function for a faction that has to be in constant conflict with another one. But that's the whole point of this. The simulator is not perfect. The simulator is definitely not God. It is closer to a demiurge, an imperfect creator of the universe. And truth be told, the simulator is doing the best they can. They are thinking logically and they are trying to act ethically. And this takes us to the key flaw on the reasoning of the simulator: to think that they were even capable of judging people in the first place. Because, as Jason explains, you cannot judge people if you don't know what they go through. Sure, you can calculate the absolute moral goodness or badness or their actions, and yet that doesn't really tell you who they could have become tomorrow. And so what they ended up with was a system that always assumes that people can be better than what you are judging them to be. Which is still not a perfect system, because you are still judging people in a way, but it's definitely better than what they were doing before. In fact, I even think you can see the simulator in the last episode, when they have this meeting of all the celestial bureaucracy, and there are many familiar faces like the judge, Sean, Michael, Chidi, and then there is this guy. Who is that guy? We have never seen him before. And I think that could be the simulator, entering the simulator just to check how everything is going. Which begs the question, how would the simulator react to all of these changes? And I think that the simulator would be fine with it, because the purpose of the simulation is to fulfill this moral imperative, right? And the simulation is still fulfilling that moral imperative. It doesn't matter if the system is quite different from what the simulator had envisioned. I think this is what Janet meant when she described the universe as just a factory of dog food, just machinery fulfilling its cosmic purpose. The purpose of the simulation is to fulfill an ethical obligation, and that's it. It's just an ethical machine running along. But it doesn't really care, or it cannot really focus on the plights, on the lives of every simulated individual. It only cares about the moral imperative of the simulator, which is why it was built in the first place. And that's why it is up to us to find the meaning in our own lives. Finally, what does this mean for the simulation theory? Well, first, I hope that in the future, when we discuss this theory, we consider how deeply unethical ancestor simulations are. They can only be created by civilizations of sociopaths. And if a civilization with any kind of moral compass has this technology and creates a simulation, they would be ethical simulations. Simulations where they try to maximize the happiness and minimize the suffering of the simulated beings. And okay, I don't think that we are in a simulation. But if we are going to consider that possibility, we should also consider that we are in an ethical simulation. And that perhaps the simulator considers that stop simulating a conscious being is unethical, which would mean that if we are in a simulation and if the simulator is ethical, then perhaps we should expect some kind of afterlife. Granted, those are a lot of ifs, and in fact, I think more likely that we are in the real universe, but it still is very fun to consider. And that's it. That's the end of what I had to say. I know it was a very long video, but hey, you stay until the end. So I want to know what you think. So please go in the comments and tell me, do you think we live in a simulation? Do you think convincing my arguments about the ethics of simulating other conscious beings? What did you think about my use of Black Mirror and The Good Place? I want to know it all. Please tell me in the comments. And thanks a lot for watching. You might enjoy this other video if you still have time somehow. But maybe go to my channel, check the playlist and see if there's anything there you like. And so yeah, thanks for watching and maybe, just maybe, I'll see you there in The Good Place.